Hi, so today we have a very interesting guest. His name is Yoram Hazony. He's an Israeli philosopher. He's also a Bible scholar. He helped one of the people behind the Herzl Institute in Jerusalem. He's a chairman of the Edmund Burke Foundation. He's a very, very fascinating thinker, very original thinker. Amongst other ideas of his he's really, I guess, a traditionalist in a very deep political philosophy, a conservative in the sense of Burke in the belief in tradition, and as a Jew, the importance of the Jewish tradition for Western political thought as well. So very fascinating. He's written books defending nationalism, which you'd have thought, oh my goodness, isn't that a terrible thing? He's written books on the fact that the Hebrew Bible can be taken as a rich philosophical text that can be explored in the Western tradition against something original. And I'm going to be questioning about how you can argue that the Bible is a philosophical text. It's a religious text, that's for sure, but how do you look at it as a philosophical text? And some of his other views, we'll be exploring what he thinks about the world today. My experience with him is he has a very sweeping worldview, and his statements and analysis can very encompassing, which on the one hand is very powerful because it gives narrative to things. I'm going to see if I can question some of the details as they emerge, but I am excited to meet an original thinker and somebody who's wrestling with all sorts of fascinating ideas at the nexus of Jewish tradition, Western political thought, and the world of yesterday, today, and hopefully we'll get some discussion about tomorrow too. So I'm quite excited to welcome you. So today we have a real privilege and honor of being joined by Yoram Hazony, who's a very original, very important thinker in the world today. So Yoram, I'm going to get straight in. I've had the privilege of interacting with you in the past and learning a lot from you. You've written on a whole bunch of different topics and subjects. The one that I want to really start with today is the philosophy of the Hebrew Scripture. You came up with this, I think, very original idea, controversial to many, that actually we typically look at the Hebrew Bible as the Torah and Tanakh as a book of religion, tradition, narrative, law, etc. But the Greeks had philosophy. Plato, Aristotle, starting from first principles, examining the world, analyzing what's going on and coming up with conclusions and theorems. And you put forward the case that the Hebrew Scripture should be read, at least as much as the Greeks, as philosophy. So obviously there's that sort of thing which when people hear it, I remember when I first heard it, strikes as very, very strange. Why? I mean, in what way? Philosophy book starts with a problem. What is the nature of good? Analyze it, objectively, without a preconceived notion, without relying on revelation, without God telling us the answer, using our brain and analyzing things till we can reach a conclusion. That certainly isn't the style that's anywhere in Torah or Tanakh. It's God giving this, the prophets giving that. And so maybe could you explain a little bit in what sense this apparently surprising thesis is in fact for you actually what I just said is incorrect?
As I was sitting there and studying this story, this teaching, it just struck me over and over again that how extraordinarily strange it is to tell the story of the West with the entire Jewish influence eliminated, as though it doesn't exist. Now, there's some innocent reasons for doing it this way, but the feeling that I had overwhelmingly in university was that it wasn't innocent, that the purpose of telling the story in this way is to suppress the impact of Torah and Tanakh and later Jewish sources on civilization.
Because I would have thought, I mean, nobody denies that Aquinas and Augustine and, going to clearly have very strong religious Christian and Jewish roots to their thinking. Locke and Hobbes are going to bring in biblical things. So is that, you actually think is literally deliberate?
This anti-Semitic message was used to construct a picture, the picture of ideas in the history of the West, which goes from Athens to Berlin, like on this gigantic superhighway, and systematically eliminates Jewish influence wherever it appears. And this is, as I said, this was originally motivated by a conscious anti-Semitism. Today, it's already, most of the conscious anti-Semites are are long gone, but the story has been handed down in a Masoret, in a kind of tradition, and universities teach this anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic view of the history of ideas today without necessarily having bad motives, simply because that's what people believe. So that opens the question. Now, obviously, in Jews, in our Masoret, we see our, the Kadosh Baruch Hu, the God of Israel, as the one and only God, and there's a good reason that we might not want to mix up our Torah with this kind of Greek pagan philosophical religion. But as far as academia is concerned, the claim that there's this sharp break between the Torah, which should not be included in philosophy because it was given by a god and it's theological, and Greek philosophy, it's simply a sham.
I was speaking a week ago actually to Eric Nelson, also on this discussion, and he was saying that he also had not dissimilar view about the impact of Torah on thought at the pre-Enlightenment beginning of the political philosophy. The Hebrew Republic was his book where he spoke about the fact that it was the rediscovery, the Hebraists in the 17th century who'd kind of come up with by re-exploring and finding the ancient Hebrew texts, the Torah and specifically rabbinic texts, started to think about the concept of an anti-monarchic system, the republic, and started to think, or not the concept of it, but actually the monarchy might be an illegitimate institution.
Right.
The notion that the egalitarian role of the state based on Yovel, and the concept of religious tolerance based on the fact that Torah, the rabbis speak about the Noahide law, that a person could be non-Jewish and not keep all of Torah and be part of the religious state. And so he showed how these ideas had enormous shaping, and then they were kind of, their Hebrew roots were forgotten or expunged. He thought it was not deliberate. I asked him how that came to be. Was it the Enlightenment thinkers had removed it, and some of them were clearly anti-Semitic? He thought that wasn't actually what happened, and he had his own account. He actually did mention that in the early 1900s, in Germany, it would have been more known, this particular story of this journey from the 17th into the 18th century. So I'm curious about, you feel very much that there was this kind of conscious move even earlier than that in German academia to remove any biblical reference.
The purpose of German academia was to aspire to teach Germans to be like ancient Greeks. Now, that in Europe 200 years ago, the theory that the purpose of higher education is to teach your people to be like ancient Greeks is a theory that takes aim directly at one thing, which is at the Jewish influence and the subsequent Christian reception of the Jewish influence. So Eric is an excellent historian, and I learn a tremendous amount from his books. I don't have any reason to think that he would disagree with what I'm saying, and since I didn't hear the conversation, I can't get into an argument with him. But I don't think there's any kind of a doubt that this is what happened.
Plato does appeal to the Pindar and men of religion, and about the idea that the soul kind of pre-exists in this world and has ideas. But ultimately, when he develops ideas like the forms, that behind every pen in the world is an abstract perfect pen, behind the color red's an abstract perfect color. And as he develops the theory of the state, he doesn't seem to stop and say, well, what makes this true is the God said so, right? And surely that is what characterizes philosophy. So, for example, when Maimonides, when Rambam writes Mishnah Torah, no one, I don't think generally, well, I should say, I might contradict myself, but generally speaking, people wouldn't usually refer to it as a work of philosophy, although it has a few philosophical components. When he writes Moreh Nevuchim, the guide, you can distinguish the clearly philosophical parts that are unambiguously philosophical. Let's say the end of the first section, all the way through the beginning of the second section, when he's grappling with proofs of God's existence, that you wouldn't doubt is philosophy. But when he talks about the Tamei Mitzvot, the reasons for the mitzvahs, you might say that isn't philosophy. So where do you draw the line of what is and what isn't philosophy?
To go back to that story about me in graduate school, what struck me when we were studying these texts is how closely the subject matter is related to what we find in Torah. Now, at the time I was studying, as I said, I was studying political philosophy. So the question is, what are the origins of the state, and what's the nature of political good, and how do you achieve the longevity of the state, and what kind of political order is best, and what is human nature, and how is it to be understood in its relation to the pursuit of the good and to the pursuit of justice. Now, all of these questions, including the role of the gods in establishing the state, all of these questions are perfectly good Torah questions. I mean, Tanakh is full of them and Chazal is full of them. And so the immediate question for me was, well, why should you draw a line? And at this point, you just have to throw up your hands and say, for 1,000 years, Christians thought that Jewish sources were a reasonable source for ideas, and it's only with the Enlightenment, it's only 250 years ago, or 200 years ago, that the West puts up this barrier and says, no, these are religious sources, and so we don't learn anything from them. I don't see any reason to draw a line, and I think it's up to others to show why there should be a line. If indeed you can take the Tanakh as seeking what in the Western tradition is called philosophy, chokhmah, wisdom. Philosophia is the love of wisdom. It's avat chokhmah. If that's what the Torah is doing, and if that's what the Greeks are doing, so why should they not be compared in an academic or a philosophical setting?
Have you reached conclusions? What do you think your discoveries have been in actually what is the Tanakh's view, or what set of views might there be as to what the ideal political system is, or might, or are, or a range of possibilities? And I want to also get to how that might impact on our thinking about the world today and tomorrow. But first of all, yeah.
You know, when you go to yeshiva and you study Torah, you would be surprised, if you're aware of this, to discover. Actually, I think even without yeshiva, if you read it by yourself, you would be surprised to discover that the God of Israel is not only speaking to the Jews, and he's not only teaching local knowledge, but that the story that the Torah tells is the story of all mankind. That step of claiming knowledge that is appropriate to all human beings and for all of human history, that step makes the Torah from the perspective of the Western tradition, of the Western philosophical tradition, it makes the Torah a philosophical text because that's its interest.
What you're effectively saying is that within Torah, if I've understood correctly, there's the universal and the particular. There's a particular relationship between the Jewish people and God, but also the very fact that it begins with creation and a vision of humanity rather than beginning with the Jewish people, and that its end and vision of the end of history, I guess also, at least in the biblical prophets, involves a vision for humanity. Therefore, it's not just a story of the particular relationship between God and Israel, but also the universal. Is that correct? And therefore,
that's certainly true. I just would add that it's not that the references to the Torah and the universal don't end, you know, in Breshit Yud Bet in the 12th chapter of Genesis when Abraham appears. When do you meet a learned Jew who thinks that the Torah is only for Am Yisrael, and that it wasn't given in order to teach the world? For reasons that are that we've discussed, the Chachamim, the wise men and women among the Gentiles have constructed these institutions which are whether purposely or not, systematically suppress the Torah so that its knowledge cannot get out to the rest of the world. And this at a time when we have greater free speech, you know, greater ability to communicate, technological means of communication. In fact, just a greater interest among the nations of the world in what the Jews have to say than at virtually any point before in our history.
Okay, so let's jump. I want to jump in the following. We're right now sitting down in lockdown with the coronavirus. We've got a world where even before then is falling into tribalism. People are nervous about the rise of some kind of nationalist spirit and everything from Brexit in Britain to kind of protectionism in America and the war between America, the trade wars between America and China, even before the acrimony over Corona. We've got a world where in America in particular, the politics is so divisive. It's almost like each side is convinced the other side are genuinely evil people, and so on and so forth. The divisions of media, the tearing apart of society. You've got religious warfare in the world and threats of terrorism. We've got a lot going on in the world. What do you think we would extract from Torah in terms of its philosophical view that would have a universal message? What sort of messages would there be? Or, what is the ideal structure? What could we be learning that would provide a great voice for humanity moving forward?
Let's take a very, very current example. It used to be when Western countries were still Christian, they considered the commandment to honor your father and your mother to be a centerpiece of the construction of a just political order. I was just reading in John Adams. John Adams was a founding father of the United States, the second president of the United States. So I was just reading in John Adams his discussion of the fact that honoring your father and your mother is the basis not only for all family life, but also for the life of the community and the life of the nation. Because when you honor your parents and your grandparents, you in fact honor the entire tradition and inheritance that you received from the past. Well, when you do that, you provide the fundamental framework for all political life. Now, that's something people used to know, but today we Jews who are observant and traditional, and we continue to consider honoring your parents to be the basis of political and social life. We're in an extreme minority because who agrees with this? I mean, seriously, go to which public schools teach honoring your parents and your grandparents and your ancestors? What are you taught that you need to sacrifice in order to honor your parents and your ancestors and your tribe and your nation? Nothing. It's been almost entirely eliminated, and we can see this today. The coronavirus is disproportionately affects older people, and the arguments are shocking and frightening. People say, and I mean, prominent politicians and intellectuals say, well, if people are over 70, they're close to the ends of their lives. So what could you do? They're close to death anyway. They probably would have died from something else. So we can't take the life of an older person as being as valuable as the life of a young person who still has their entire life ahead of them. Now, I can't tell you how many times I've heard this horrifying argument, both in the UK and in the American media. I've heard it dozens of times in the last few weeks.
I mean, I was going to say that the voices may be there, but the level of policy making, I mean, certainly here we are in England, people are all over America, all over the world, who are actually facing a massive economic disaster, and we've all locked down specifically to protect the 70-year-olds, by and large, and other people who are vulnerable. So I'm not convinced that sensitivity is completely left on. I hear there may be voices, and we can.
Well, I think we may have a small disagreement on this point.
There's so much. Every time you speak, there's like so many different angles, so many things going through. There's things I don't agree, things I do agree, things I want to argue, things. But
would you like me to speak less?
Okay, you're definitely down to provoke and how to evoke ideas. That's for sure. And there's a lot in there. So let me try to see if I can. Let me reflect my own thoughts and see how they resonate or don't. Because one of the things I've looked at, I remember a number of years ago trying to give a course and researching for a course in Jewish political theory. by which I meant, going back to sources. And on the one hand, you think it's going to be straightforward because, as you say, Tanakh has so much political discussion. It clearly approves of some types and disapproves of others, and same with the commentaries. And yet, what was amazing is, whilst we have clearly a vision of what the Messianic era ought to look like, and even that we're not quite sure what that means, says the Rambam, says Maimonides, but actually, because there's so little discussion in Torah, for example, as to whether a king is a good or bad idea, it just sort of pops in for 3 or 4 verses, a few verses quickly in Deuteronomy. If you want a king, make sure they don't have too much money, horses or wives, whatever. And they have to be subject to the Torah, and that's it, boom. And then when it comes to appointing one, the prophet Shmuel gets very upset, and to the point where the Rambam Maimonides will say, no, a king is an ideal, monarchy is a Jewish value, and Abarbanel will say, no, it's absolutely not a Jewish value. And what struck me in analyzing this is it's not easy to extract what the right political system for this type of phase of history is, not from the Torah itself, not from Tanakh. There's times when it sounds like living without a king is better, times when it sounds like living with a king is better. There's in the Rishonim, the justification for the type of social structure. You've got the Rashbam, who says it has to be effectively a social contract. This is going back 1,000 years, and you've got others who use different arguments. And what struck me is that there is a paucity of specific sources that guide us. Possibly, this is a theory, is because there isn't necessarily one perfect political system all the time. Jewish towns in history often did take votes and use what you might call today democracy. There were other times when they would leave it to Tuvei era kind of council, which sometimes wasn't elected. Depends where in history. And what struck me is one thing you absolutely can't argue about in Torah, where you can't disagree that there is tons of, is social philosophy. I've made this point to other people as well, but it feels to me like you could really talk about pretty unambiguously what the range of possible social organized units are. Yes, families you've spoken about is clearly core. The Jewish people are created that night, sitting in their homes with their families, and it's front and center. Relationships, respect for the past, future, as you talked about, but also the way we care about the weakest and the poorest in a society. That's thematic. That you can't get away from. The prophet can come and critique whatever political ruler there is if they're not caring about the weakest in society. So it feels to me like a Torah gives us much stronger sense of the social fabric, even to the point where the book of Ruth, which should take us on a transition from the era of the judges right to the birth of David, you'd expect it to be a political philosophy. And it's all about relationships between a few individuals and ultimately the reconstruction of a society on the basis of getting those types of relationships right. So I'd almost feel that Torah is giving us much more of a social philosophy than a particular political philosophy.
Well, yes and no. The reason I'd like to say no is because there's a certain distortion there is a difference between, before I was talking about the similarities between Greek philosophy and the philosophy of the Torah and the Nevi'im and of Chazal. And there are similarities. That's the reason that we can compare them. But once you start comparing them, you find that there are crucial differences, substantive differences. One of the principal substantive differences is that Plato and Aristotle and the tradition that follows them, they're very, very concerned with this idea of the ideal form. The ideal form of government, but that's just part of a broader metaphysics of believing that there exist ideal forms somewhere out there in rational space that the human mind can approach, that we can, by thinking, find the ideal form. And so they're constantly looking for the ideal form of the state. Now, that metaphysical prejudice towards believing that the human mind can attain ideal forms by thinking, that prejudice does not exist in the Jewish tradition. And the consequence of having this very kind of different kind of metaphysics is that biblical thought is focused on trying to locate what is called emet. Emet is what is amin, or what is ne'eman, that is truth understood as that which is stable and can be relied upon. So you find that Moses, the greatest of the prophets, what makes him the greatest is that he's Eved Ne'eman, that he's the most reliable. What makes God the the God that we should follow is because he's Ha'el HaNe'eman. He's the stable God in the midst of all of the constant chaos and change. Now, when you try to understand what does the Bible have to teach about the state, or what do Chazal have to teach about the state, you have to remember that what they're looking for is what is capable of lasting, what is capable of standing, what is capable of holding good, omed v'kayam, in a world of constant flux. The main thing that's being pursued is the question of, is it possible to live a life of justice and of freedom without a state, right? That's a much more fundamental political question than the question of the best regime, which the Greeks ask. And in that discussion, there are answers, and the answers they're reasonably clear. I'm not saying that the Masorah doesn't have disagreement. Of course it does, but the answers are reasonably clear.
The obvious question is, of course, the law is meant to be eternal. We're still keeping Shabbat to this day. We're still not eating pork to this day. It says in the Torah. What's your? Well,
look, I certainly don't want your listeners to think that they should start, that they should start violating the Torah because the time has come to change it. But you're very well aware that Chazal know that that there may be changes in the law when the Mashiach comes at the end of days, and the reason that they leave open that possibility is because they don't want to go down the road of Greek philosophy, which sees everything in terms of the human mind being able to grasp ideals and them being permanent.
In other words, what we're really saying then is the very fact that this world is seen as an olam hazeh, as a temporary state of reality, but it will reveal a deeper reality in olam haba, in the world as it will be in the future, is itself exactly that point.
It is that point. All of these are examples in which the basic Torah law that's applicable to human beings doesn't change, but the greater framework of how we think about it and how we approach our life in the world does change. And Chazal absolutely, for 1,000 years, Chazal, up until Sadia gone, Chazal refused to accept these Aristotelian eternal forms into the study of the Torah for 1,000 years. In other words, everything may change. And part of our humility, as opposed to the limited humility of Aristotle, part of our humility is the understanding that we are approaching the attempt to find what is general and eternally true. We're approaching that with very limited minds, with very limited abilities. We're not God. We do not have perfect reason. We don't have the ability to know the eternal mind of God, and in a world which is itself always in danger of possibly being returning to God forbid, to the world of the flood, as you can see these last few weeks with this new disease. That humility makes the Torah a better basis, in my view, for the search for truth, moral truth and scientific truth, and truth in terms of government, because it doesn't claim to know that for all time and in all places it's wrong to have a king. So I completely agree with you that the Torah, from our perspective, is unchanging, and our responsibility is to keep it and teach it as unchanging. But if you're asking philosophically, is our framework like an Aristotelian one, in which things are absolutely eternal and absolutely essential, which is without any exceptions, or a Platonic one where things are absolutely perfect? The answer is that we don't recognize that kind of, I would say, extremist philosophy to be accessible to human beings.
You write your more recent book about nationalism, as you've already quoted it, and nationalism has become a bit of a negative word in the world, certainly post World War II. And yet you see it as virtuous. Would you argue that's also a biblical model of things, or at least in this particular state in history, that's what the Bible wants us to aspire towards?
So these kinds of imperial states, including Egypt and Babylonia and Assyria and later Persia, they are the central political problem in the Tanakh that the prophets are wrestling with. They consider these empires to be evil, and it's very, very important to understand what an extraordinary theological revolution and revolution in political theory this was, because as far as we know, up until the time of the prophets, all of these civilizations considered the king to have a commandment, a mitzvah from the gods to go out and conquer as much of the world as they possibly could. Every single one of these empires had gods commanding the king to conquer the four corners of the earth, and they had a good reason for it. It wasn't just crazy. Their claim was that they were going to bring prosperity and peace to mankind for the first time by conquering the four corners of the earth. We've got, God, creator of heaven and earth, talking to Moshe. And we know that the law that he gives Moshe is supposed to be good for all mankind. Maybe not every single commandment. Maybe they're not supposed to build a temple. Maybe the Jews only are supposed to build a temple. But certainly at the level of the basics, Moshe gets a Torah that is supposed to be for all mankind. Now, why is God, creator of heaven and earth, giving Moses a Torah for all mankind? And then he turns around at the beginning of Deuteronomy, and he says to him, but you're not allowed to cross the border into the lands of your neighbors, not 1 inch, because I've given those lands to other nations. Why? Why are there borders? There are no borders. The Assyrians don't have any borders. The Assyrians only have a commandment to go out and conquer the whole world. Every single year they go out for 300 years to try to conquer the world. But we have borders. The idea that there is a limit to what you and your king and your armies are supposed to go out and conquer. And that limit is a hard limit. It's not up to you to decide of your own free will that the Chinese really need the Torah. And so it's up to us to go and conquer China. And the only problem is that we don't have the strength to do it. No, there is a different problem. The problem is that our God doesn't want us to do it. And so the birth of the idea that each nation has borders, the idea that each nation should be ruled by its own kings, right? And that's also in Deuteronomy, that we're not allowed to have a king from another people. We're not allowed to have a prophet from another people, right? There are prophets among the nations, but those prophets are not for us. They don't speak to us. Only our prophets speak to us. This complex of thoughts that we believe that we have the best law on earth. We believe that we should be a light to the nations, then that if the nations imitate us, they will be blessed, and that we should teach them. But at the same time, we have our own king, and no one else is going to rule here. We have our own prophets, and no one else is going to be a prophet in Israel other than our own people. And we have our own borders, and that creates the limited space in which we are going to build whatever we can build. That set of ideas is the historical foundation for what later ends up being called nationalism. The prophetic ideal or idea that the world is governed best when it consists of many different independent nations. The violent nations lie down The big, powerful nations lie down with the small, weak nations, and no one is afraid. That's what the prophets are looking for.
What concerns you most about the future? What worries you most, if anything does, about where we are today and where we're going tomorrow?
What worries me most? How much time you got? Well, look, after World War II, the Western nations decided that they didn't need nations and religions anymore, that those things were too dangerous to have around. And the modern political theory of liberalism, not the classical theory, but I'm talking about the contemporary theory of liberalism, was born out of this trauma of the world wars, in which people came out and they just said governments are too dangerous to be allowed to have opinions on substantive matters like how we should live, what our philosophy and our religion and our nationality is, and so we have to abandon that. And thus was born a modern liberal philosophy, which is systematically detached from God and Torah, from Masoret, from tradition, from the traditional moral teachings, which most of the Christian nations used to accept the Ten Commandments, at least in theory, and now that's gone. And the rapid decline that you're describing, the world that you're describing, I see it the way you see it. That's what worries me most. That's what keeps me up at nights. That's what moves me to write and to teach and to appear on podcasts. Is the question: is it possible for us still to return to tradition, to God, and to Scripture, and to revive a basis for these countries, all of the Western nations, before they tear themselves apart internally or are overrun by foreign enemies, which looks unlikely now, but wait a few years, it will become more and more real.
You mentioned that countries may be falling apart from within, but you also mentioned a particular intolerance, and you also mentioned tearing themselves apart. There's different dynamics here, it seems to me, that tearing apart, actually, particularly in America, is actually not just by the anti-traditionalists, but also by the traditionalists. There seems that's almost
of course, I'm not. Look, I'm definitely in the camp of the traditionalists and the nationalists, but I'm not under any illusion that we're the good guys and they're the bad guys, and there's only good guys on our side and there's only bad guys on the other. That's preposterous. That's infantile thinking. That's not what's happening. What's happening is that in order to be able to maintain an internally peaceful state, there needs to be sufficient consensus on the ground rules, on the basics, so that even while people are desperately fighting with one another over all sorts of crucial political and religious issues, they know where the boundaries are. Every nation has internally, always in human history, this is part of the beauty of human beings, is there's always people coming up with new tribes, and the tribes within the nation compete with one another. The question is, are they only going to compete with one another, or are they going to war? Are they going to start killing each other in the streets? And there are different mechanisms for preventing that. The best mechanism that we know of, which we call democracy, is in fact an agreement among the tribes to take turns in ruling. So that there's some kind of an electoral system, some kind of mechanism for transition from the rule of one tribe to the rule of another. But the key in a democracy or in any peaceful society is that the tribes are bound by sufficient loyalty to one another so that when I win and you lose, you say, well, I disagree with Yoram completely, but he won fair and square. He's a legitimate contender, and I'm going to support him until the next election and when it's my turn. And then we switch places. Then you, Rabbi Rowe, you win and I lose. Okay, and when you win, then I say, I completely disagree with Rabbi Rowe, but he's sufficiently legitimate, so I'm going to support his governing, his running the government until I get my next turn. And that requires as Rabbi Sachs says, a joint project, which is the independent nation and its well-being, and it requires an internal mutual loyalty among the tribes, which allows them to continue to compete and maybe even to hate each other, but not so much that they that they break the traditional boundaries and say, well, Rabbi Rowe won the election. He's not legitimate. He's not. And so I don't need to help him to govern. I don't care if it's his turn because he's not legitimate. And I'm going to create a resistance. And my resistance is its purpose is going to be to prevent him from being able to rule. That is the end of democratic regime, and it doesn't really matter whether one side is doing it or the other side or both sides, because as soon as one side says the other side's not legitimate, you're finished. You don't have a joint project anymore.
Final thought from me, you can then bring in many final thoughts, Yoram, is that so the world is in a state of chaos and flux, and it feels like often the traditionalist. You're very strongly in that camp politically today. Obviously, I am in the religious sense, but sometimes wants to hold on to what was. But exactly what you spoke about earlier, very fact that Torah doesn't give us that stable rigidity of a political system, suggests that as the ground sweeps from under our feet, what we need to be searching for perhaps is not so much a going back to the past as what can we nurture from that vision to construct something new into the future. It always strikes me that the Torah ultimately is a constitution for the future. Ultimately, we try to live with that vision of how the world will be and try to get the world closer to it. The Mamlechet Kohanim, the kingdom of priests, are trying to bring the world to perfection, that it return to Eden, I guess, a return to some kind of oneness of humanity in relationship with God. And does it not necessitate then, as the world's shaking itself apart, or as technologies are emerging and new possibilities are arising, that rather than go back to where were we 200 years ago, where were we 400 years ago, or where was this and this classical liberal thinker, or so, why don't we start thinking about what could be different to what it is today, that's even more aligned with the wisdom that we're trying to pursue and discover and find in the world? Why do we need to keep going back?
We need to keep going back because, well, there's. I agree with you that we don't have any reason to think that anybody ever can really go back. I mean, what you can do is you can draw on the past in order to find models that are healthier. Those kinds of revolutions, they have a tendency to very quickly devolve into me saying, look, I've got this brilliant idea, you should be convinced. And many other people saying, well, we're not convinced. We don't do things that way. And then you're left with no choice either to give up, but you have only two choices. Either you give up or you force them. And so most revolutions end up being horrific bloodbaths and going on for decades, maybe generations before they reach their ideal dream state. And then once they get there, they realize it was not such a good idea that this guy came up with originally. So I'm not a revolutionary in that sense. I don't believe any of us is smart enough to create a new blueprint out of whole cloth. And so I look for what there is in the traditions of every nation that can be strengthened and turned into a new beginning.
I hope I've still got plenty of heart left. Thank you very, very much. I think that's it time-wise from us, but I want to really thank you for your time and for so many thought-provoking and evoking ideas. It really, really is an honor to spend time with you, and hope all is well and you keep well
Great
and
to
safe.
see you again, and thank you for all the time and the attention. I appreciate it. God bless you.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.